I'm John Burden. I am the director of the Ocean Policy Program at the Nicholas Institute, and had the pleasure of working with Dan for a number of years at the World Bank. We were together, and I'm kind of disappointed we only met towards the end of our careers there, but I really enjoyed the collaboration. We were looking at tenure systems across fisheries and forestry where Dan was working. And for those of you who don't know Dan, he's an assistant professor of natural resources and environmental sciences at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And before that, as I mentioned, he was staff at the World Bank in the global program on forests at the bank. And then prior to that, at the MacArthur Foundation. And then did his training, got his PhD in the School of Natural Resources and Environment at the University of Michigan. So without further ado, given our limited time, I'm going to pass the mic to Dan Miller, and please welcome Dan this morning.
Wonderful. Thanks, John. Thanks to you and also Javier and the organizers of this series for having me. It's fantastic to be here at the Nicholas School. I'm in a department of natural resources and environmental sciences, which has about 24 faculty members. But you are like on steroids, you're like us on steroids here, and it's great. So I did my PhD, as John said, at Michigan, which is a very comparable, I think, place to the Nicholas School. It's great to be in an environment with so many, I guess, like-minded, or at least people interested in the same topics. So I'm interested today to talk with you about some work that I've done over the past several years, and that's emerging on efforts to try to assess the long-term effects of international aid for forests, as you can see here. This is where I'd like to take us on our journey. So I think it's worth always, we're in an environment school, so I'll kind of breeze through this, but I think it's worth reminding ourselves of the importance of forests, why tropical forests in particular matter. And then I want to spend a bit of time talking about the question of finance for forests, particularly from public international aid agencies, and how we track that finance and understand where it's flowed in the world. And then, of course, the million-dollar question, or billion-dollar question, literally, is what's the effectiveness of all this finance? And so that's part 3 of the talk. I want to reflect on sort of where we are at this point in the literature in terms of our ability to assess what the effect on people's lives, on biodiversity, on carbon is or has been of all of this investment that's been made. And then the fourth part is where I'll spend actually the most of my talk on this idea of predictive proxy indicators, which emerged from work that I started when I was at the World Bank. So, there we go. Okay, so this is going to be this, you're going to know this. But anyway, so importance of tropical forests in particular from a biodiversity standpoint. I am always amazed that 7% of the world's land, that half of the species. We have some folks that do marine things here. A lot of species are also in the water, tropical waters. And I think this third bullet point about being vital to ecosystem functioning is what I think directly connects to what I was concerned with working at a development agency at the World Bank, which is how it is that forests matter to development. And just some quick factoids. There's been some really great research done in the last few years to try to quantify the contribution that forests are making to people that live in or near forests to their incomes. And we're finding that more updated figures on how people depend on forests, and then just how important forest-related income actually is in the livelihood portfolios of many people around the world. So on average, a C4 study that many of you might know, that was from 24 different countries, found that people living in or near forests get about the equivalent that they get from agriculture, but from forests. So if you're interested in development in rural areas in the developing world, and there's forests, you're missing something important if you're not considering the forests. And then this forest ecosystem services as being really important in supporting other sectors of the economy, other livelihood strategies, I think is a really important, and we're beginning to understand these connections more. But I think the ecosystem service contributions of forests to agriculture in particular, but energy and other sectors, is something that is kind of a research frontier. There's some really neat work emerging. I wanted to include this slide just to, I think this is a nice summary from a new book from the Center for Global Development called Why Forests, Why Now by Jonah Bush and Francis Seymour. And I think they've got some nice kind of infographics about forests that I think are worth using and seeing. So some of the development contributions of forests. And then this gets to the topic of our talk. So just trying to think about forest cover change, or sort of however we might measure forest quality. We can consider sort of negative human influences that would then be pushing the state of forests downward. But there might be some positive things that we can do, hopefully, to lead to forest conservation, better forest management. The drivers of deforestation is a whole literature, just trying to summarize some of the main drivers that we see across the tropical world. And what I want to focus on is that a lot of the models of drivers of deforestation don't seem to incorporate things that might counteract deforestation. So you don't often see integrated in the same model the sort of drivers of deforestation and things that might counter it. And I'd like to argue that one thing that might counter it, of course, is policy effort. And as a measure of that, thinking about dollars, dollars that flow into particular areas. So funding allocation. So that brings us to part 2. Again, just reminding us of the importance of funding for conservation. And I'm going to start off focusing on conservation specifically, but want to recognize that there's all kinds of funding that might go for forests, including funding for development that might be clearing forests for oil palm and taking the revenues from timber, things like that. But focusing initially here on the conservation funding side. And it's an obvious point, but I think it's worth stating that money matters, that financial resources actually have been shown, as we probably know from our own lives, to matter to different outcomes, particularly in the case of conservation. And I won't talk about it here, but we're working on a sort of global study to look at the effectiveness of conservation finance on threatened species for so biodiversity funding, and finding that consistently the funding part is the critical variable and really important for describing or explaining less high numbers of threatened species. We're getting better at understanding the amounts. We have information on what's needed and how we can allocate it, but empirically, we don't have as much knowledge as I think we need on actually what's spent. And it's kind of a basic bean counting thing, but it's actually, I would argue, really important. So we're beginning to have better knowledge of actual spending, and then what explains the patterns in funding. And we're beginning to get a better sense of that. We're also beginning to get a better sense at a spatial scale within countries of how funding flows are being allocated. But this, I would argue, is really kind of also a frontier area. A lot of the studies, including my own work, has been largely at a national cross-country scale. An exception is Paul Armsworth, who's here, who's done much finer grain scale. But in developing countries, it's often either at the very site-specific kind of protected area level or at a national scale. And there's some emerging work that's looking and trying to map funding flows at within countries. So why do we care? Knowing where the money goes can help us. It's only by knowing that basic information can we identify needs and gaps and be more effective in how we spend the money. So this is some work that I did as part of my PhD a few years back, but basically we used this aid data database, which has just come out with a really cool new interface for anyone who's interested in this topic that's geo-referencing the aid within it, and it's a really nice tool to be able to use. When we were looking at it a couple years ago, we used keywords and had undergraduate brute force labor coding every single project in the data set. There were 50,000 revealed by our keyword search, of which we found about 10,000, 9,500 to be relevant to, were actually biodiversity aid from 1980 to 2008. And just sort of a summary of trends that we found in aid. So 1980 was chosen as the start date because that was the year of the World Conservation Strategy, which for the first time put biodiversity and conservation on the international development agenda. And so we thought, well, let's see if what kind of aid was happening back then and before the Rio conference. So that big spike that you see is 1992, the year of the Rio conference, when donors sought to make a big splash by funding biodiversity. Of course, it went down in the next years, but on average, you can see an overall increase. I have a slide usually that I show that I didn't put in, but you know, this is not really that much money. It's less than $2 billion a year, and we found that the promises made by donors at Rio have never been met in any subsequent year. And that biodiversity-related aid is just dwarfed by other kinds of aid. So this was brought home to me working as a staff member at the bank. So the forestry portfolio at the World Bank was 0.78% of the lending portfolio of the institution. So the big bad World Bank that we like to criticize, you know, it's probably arguably the most important player in the international forestry donor space by volume, but within itself, it's less than 1% of the overall portfolio. They like to say 1% of the lending and 90% of the headaches, which is, you know. But anyway, just to give you a sense that this isn't as much money as we probably would like or is probably required. We did find, however, even if it's less than we need, whoops. Oh, well, that's weird. Anyway, we did find that it's actually well allocated generally to countries of greater need, measured by a number of threatened species or endemism, and then also to countries that are comparatively well governed. So we found that using the worldwide governance indicators, that better governed countries on average received more aid, which we can imagine would make sense, that donors would want their dollars to go farther. However, even if that's true on average, we did other work with Anthony Waldron and other colleagues to find out that many key countries for biodiversity are highly underfunded. I will meet, I hope, with your dean, but he's done some really important work on conservation finance in Malaysia, which was at the top of the list in terms of relatively underfunded compared to its need based on numbers of threatened species and the money that it gets. So this is the point I was making before. I was showing you work that we did on conservation, but there's all kinds of different forestry interventions. I've listed some of them here. And so we are only tracking those that we think would have a positive impact on conservation generally or on forest cover. But some might have a negative impact. We've begun to disaggregate the aid and think about, this is about strict and mixed aid, kind of very broad categories. But I think there's a frontier to sort of disaggregate different sorts of aid and what the theoretical expectations we might have about the effect that different sorts of aid might have. We're also at the infants in the, I think, very early stages of understanding, well, is payments for ecosystem services as an approach better than a strict protected area versus joint forest management? How do we compare these different strategies? Do we know which one might work better in which context? I'm afraid we don't, and I would love to hear otherwise from those of you who might know in the audience. But I think we're at an early stage of really understanding which approaches might be more effective in which contexts, and for which ends. So some of the kind of frontiers here, I think, are, first of all, just the boring bean counting part. Donors have to report on their financing under the Rio Conventions, under international treaties, but they do it in wildly different ways. And if you think about it, their incentives are to show that they're doing a lot, right? That they're funding a lot under, whether it's climate, biodiversity, etc. And so there's a tendency to kind of over-report on what counts as biodiversity or climate-related aid. And there have been some studies that show kind of some absurd titles of projects that have been included as climate aid. But the keyword approach that we used took a lot of labor and time. It's just not feasible. And as you saw, the data only go through 2008, and we're already in 2017. So is there a way that we can automate this process? And so I'm looking into using machine learning as a way to hopefully help facilitate this process. As I mentioned, spatial information at the subnational level on flows of funding is also really important. And then this point about different kinds of forest-related aid. Not all of it is the same. If we think about just the conservation part, it's a little bit easier. But if we broaden to the range of different forestry interventions, it could be expected to have different effects on forest cover. So, current understanding and challenges in understanding the effectiveness of all this money. This is a quote from, this is the reason that I got a job at the World Bank, basically. But it's important beyond my own personal story. So the World Bank Forest Strategy of 2002 guided investment for up until very recently. And there was an evaluation, a 10-year evaluation done, finally published in 2013, which concluded basically that the World Bank has no idea about the effectiveness of its projects, which is not very good. And all of us in this room pay into the World Bank in some small way, and other USAID through our tax money, etc. And we want to know, is the money that we're giving, is that penny that we're giving or whatever it is, being used effectively? And so I was actually hired to help try to develop systems to address this issue, one of which is this predictive proxy indicator idea. But, the World Bank is full of smart people with a lot of experience, and, why were they having these challenges? And, there's some legitimate reasons why this is hard stuff. So forests take a long time to grow. Trees take a long time to grow in many cases. And so the benefits from different kinds of interventions might take some time to materialize. But typical interventions or investments are of limited duration in time, so maybe 3 to 5 years. And you might not expect that you'd get the biophysical change until after, maybe you get some indication during the project, but then you wouldn't really see the benefits until after the implementation period, which is a problem for accountability. Further, there might be a lag between the environmental impacts and the socioeconomic ones. And in fact, this can work the other way. You might, if it was a tree planting project, you might have some socioeconomic, social capital gains or losses or something that would occur through the action of planting and managing, thinning, etc. trees, and then not get the environmental impacts until later. So I think there's a lot of work to do to look at the kind of lag times between socioeconomic and ecological impacts. The other thing, of course, and here at Duke, you've got in the Sanford School and here in the Nicholas School some leading people who are thinking about these questions. But the problem of attribution. So how do we know, well, I like this cartoon, how do we know that cows aren't always standing up, and then when we look at them, they look like cows and then they're standing up again. But this problem of unobserved factors that might be affecting the phenomenon of interest. So there's all these confounding factors that could possibly be explaining what you see, besides funding, for example. Also, forest sector projects are often enormously complex, which is why I mentioned the thing about 90% of the headache and 1% of the lending portfolio. So they're really tough, and they require, which I think is a strength of all of you in this room, integration of socioeconomic and social science and biophysical expertise. But people are working to try to address these issues, and we have a recent paper that's tried to just tally up the number of more rigorous impact evaluations done in the forestry sector. And it's still not that many, right? So, 8 is really the maximum in any given year. And there's more focusing on having an ecological focus. And I have to say that most of these are using remotely sensed forest cover data. But there's kind of an overall upward trend. And I'm going to go quickly because I want to leave time for questions. But the point of this map is just to show that these studies are geographically kind of concentrated in specific countries. It makes sense. So Brazil, India, Mexico tend to have a higher number of studies, but there's, where are the impact evaluation studies in Central Africa, for example? I know one of you is working in Gabon, so maybe you'll be working on this. But anyway, we have pretty big gaps in our knowledge geographically, both for ecological outcomes, but particularly relating to human well-being outcomes, which are harder to measure by space or from space. Although there's a really cool recent paper in Science that is purporting to use satellite data to measure poverty, which is maybe something promising that we could look at. So there's a lot of progress in this field of kind of robustly measuring the impact of different kinds of forest interventions, particularly protected areas, I think. But they typically focus here. So if we think about a kind of classic results chain, which is what John will be well familiar with this sort of World Bank, but many implementing agencies will use this sort of a chain to think about what their project might be doing. The analysis of impact that we do typically is right at the end of the project or shortly after it's completed. But further beyond that, we don't necessarily know. And there's a lot of disincentives to collect information beyond the project period. First of all, where's the money to do it? If the funding ended for monitoring and evaluation, who's going to fund collecting data 10 years later? Actually, we found that JICA, the Japanese aid agency, does do this in some of their projects, but it's the only aid agency we could find that's actually has something in place to look at the sort of longer-term effectiveness of its work. So that brings us to the last part, this predictive proxy indicator. So PPI is a measure taken during this kind of implementation window that might tell us something about the future. So it's predictive. It's a proxy basically for a measure in the future. So it's basically a snapshot here. So this is say trees planted 5 years, after, I don't know how long this is, a year or something like that. And sometime around this period, we'd like to know, are we going to get this, or are they all going to be gone? And further, we want to know, is this woman and her child, or whoever, going to be able to derive benefits from this? But we're ANSI, we pay our taxes to the World Bank and whatever else, to governments, and we want to know in this period if we can get these things. How do we do that? So this is trying to work out sort of, this is the period where we would measure something, and we want to know, are we ultimately going to wind up here, sort of generally, or here, or worse, down here. So I want to make the case for kind of this idea in theory that practically speaking, this is potentially cost-effective kind of complement to a more rigorous impact evaluation. So just to step back, if we only know about this period, how can we say anything credible about this? The argument I'd like to make is that we need to look backward and have data over a long time period and see if there are correlations in certain key indicators with outcomes of interest, looking backward. And then be able to say, well, we have that same indicator, and based on all this prior evidence, we think that it's more or less predictive of something in the long term. That's the concept. One of the values of, so I had a workshop at the bank on this, and one of the values in doing this is actually just getting people to think, getting project designers to think about what their work might do over the long term and why the steps that they're proposing might actually lead to that or not. So there's just an intrinsic value in that process. Current impact evaluation that's ever more rigorous is kind of static. It tells you what happened right now, but the policy world is really dynamic. And so the idea here is to be forward-looking rather than just be a snapshot in time. So what we did is, first of all, developed a couple of criteria for what we think might be a good predictive indicator, and then we assessed them based on looking at World Bank projects. And then the next step is to validate them. We did that in a theory-based way, and we're just working now, actually trying to find data sets that allow us to empirically validate this. And I want to say that work in other fields has been inspirational. So in the field of education, for example, there's an economist called Raj Chetty, who's I think now at Stanford, who's published some really interesting work using education data and correlating teacher quality in 4th or 5th graders with long-term income. And so they kind of have a really neat research design where they block out other potential explanatory factors and identify your 4th grade teacher matters, folks. Basically is the finding that your 4th or 5th grade teacher, the quality of her or him matters to your future earnings. And so the question is, can we find something like that in the forest sector? We used the following criteria. So the SMART criteria, just is it a good indicator, period. So but then is there a sort of plausible, like a theory of change behind why this indicator? Can we tell a story about why this particular indicator might be predictive somehow? And what were some of those elements? That it indicated that the people who were, quote, the targets of the intervention actually would support it and not revolt against it once the funding was pulled out. So some indicator there, or an indication that people have actually changed their behavior based on the intervention, or they have greater capacity to do something and would continue to have that capacity post-intervention. And then this question of risk, is there something in the intervention that, or in the indicator about the intervention that would allow people to address particular risks that they could imagine? So we reviewed the World Bank's forestry portfolio looking at all projects that closed from 1991 to 2013. Actually, we looked at a subset of the 204. There's no good reason other than budget that we didn't do all of them. But we did select 80 of them, and we did it in a way that we sought to be representative. So we looked at every project from the top 10 forest cover countries, so we got those. And then we randomly selected by region a set of remaining projects to arrive at the 80. And we, so we basically went through and read the project reports and pulled out information, all kinds of information on the projects, including all the indicators that were used. We found almost 200 indicators in total, and then 10% of them we thought could be potential predictive proxy indicators. Interestingly to us, the kind of main objective of the projects, we pulled that out, and poverty, which is the raison d'etre of the World Bank, was only the main objective in 16% of the forestry projects. Biodiversity conservation, 20%. Climate was 0, but that's because we looked at closing of projects until 2013. And so the World Bank's climate work really didn't start until after 2009, after the Bali conference, or even 10. And so we didn't have any projects in that category. But this really struck us that the primary objective of a lot of the projects related to some good governance in some sense. So what are these things? What are some examples? What am I talking about? Kind of climate or biodiversity focused set of indicators that we developed were, the indicator was forest area brought under adaptive biodiversity friendly management plans. Okay, so we would have to unpack, what does adaptive mean? What does biodiversity friendly mean? But the main point here is that a protected area or area generally has a plan for how it might be managed as a key indicator. But that's not enough, because in order to have a plan, you'd need to be able to finance and support its implementation, hence the predictable, sustainable financing, whether there's that in place during the project period. And then that's also not enough. We thought maybe it could be, but we also need functioning institutions that actually can enforce the rules and, in particular, resolve conflicts that might arise because of the change brought by the project. And so the idea is that if we have those three things in place, and by the end of the project period we can measure change, and all three of those are going in the right direction, we think that that might mean that the project has a chance to have durable results. The second example is related to poverty reduction. And again, we have the same first, the first one is, okay, do people actually benefit from the project? Are they actually getting forest-related jobs or income from the project in the first place? The second part about property rights is what something John and I have been working on. Are property rights actually secure in this area, meaning that people would, in theory, be able to continue to derive the benefits they're getting because they have rights to derive them. But they could be getting all kinds of benefits, like by cutting down the trees. And so that's why you need the third one, that the activities are actually kind of sustainable in some sense. And so the idea of these three together is that if we see them moving in the right direction, there might be a sustainable stream of forest-related income. That's the idea. So as you can see from these examples, we didn't find many or any silver bullet sort of single indicators, but that clusters of indicators like these three that I've shown you together might have more predictive power. And that land tenure and funding might be especially important. These core sector indicators, the bank went through this exercise of developing a set of indicators so that they could track across each sector that they work in kind of key metrics. And we actually found that that exercise that they did was pretty good in terms of not only showing near-term impacts, but actually potentially being predictive. So here we are. That was in my experience working at the World Bank. I'm now a professor at the University of Illinois and working to try to empirically validate these. So we have these theory ideas, but can we find data to actually validate them? I'm working with Pushpendra Rana, a postdoc, on case and data from the Indian Himalaya, and we're interested to work closer to home in southern Illinois. And so I don't have much to say yet. This is very early, but Pushpendra has been working on a DFID-funded project that was directed at enhancing participation in forest management in the Kangra district in the Himalayas, here. And he's got a neat data set. So he was actually a forester for 15 years with the Indian Forest Service and collected all this amazing data that we're trying to figure out, can we use it to test this idea? And in this particular case, we think we can by looking at participation as kind of the key predictive indicator, and to see if we have data on the incidence of fire, well, and in the near term and then over time, so 8 to 10 years after, and to see if the incidence of fire is associated with greater participation, basically as the kind of key predictive indicator. And early results are suggesting that there might be something there. So this is the last slide, basically. I guess I want to make the argument that this is a promising approach. I don't want to say that it's a substitute for the great things that people are doing to try to assess the impact of different kinds of conservation policies, particularly using experimental and quasi-experimental research designs and modeling. But I think that this has some potential to provide certainly practical information that's being demanded, the accountability function. But it's really hard. We were talking with Paul Armsworth just before, and he's hopefully convincing me that maybe it's not as hard as I think, but I think it's pretty hard. And part of the reason is data, which data, more and more is maybe not a problem. But what are the methods that we use that are actually credible? Because the future is always uncertain, and the farther we go out, the more uncertain it is, the more confounding factors there are. Drawing inspiration from other fields is something that I think I'd like to do more of. And theory. I think I'm really glad that Professor McKean is here. But the literature on common property theory and natural resource governance, I want to think more carefully about what the work of Lynn Ostrom and Meg and others has to tell us about what leads to long-lasting systems. And then when external interventions put their thumb on the scale, what does that do to those systems? And does it shape them in a way that allows them to be stronger and move forward, or start something new that's actually effective and endures over the long term? So I think there's a lot of work been done that I think the theory we can draw on more to develop potential indicators, and then we get back to our data and methods problem. So we'll see if there's a crystal ball for forests or not. And I thank you for your attention and look forward to discussion.